When the bookstall toppled, it uncovered more than scattered paperbacks, it exposed a secret. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host, Bryant. Let's build this mystery-loving circle. Comment below and share where you're watching from. Your thoughts always bring a smile. I truly enjoy each one. Let's begin. A stranger is found dead beneath a toppled bookstall. Was it an accident or something far more deliberate? Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host one. Tell me, where in the world are you joining us from tonight? Your thoughts and presence truly bring this mystery to life. Let's begin. The day had begun with the kind of cheerful orderliness only a village like Nether Whaddon could produce. Saturday mornings in early September were reserved for the Harvest Fair, an annual tradition where bunting fluttered lazily in the breeze, Victoria sponges competed for blue ribbons, and Reverend Chiswick judged merrow sighs with ceremonial gravity. In front of the parish hall, amid jam stalls and local honey, sat the second-hand bookstall, run devoutly, year after year, by Mrs. Sylvia Pendlebury. It was just after 10 when the incident occurred. Miss Marple, her hat firmly pinned against the wind and her handbag folded in both hands, had paused beside the bookstall to examine a curious title, The Vicar's Widow's Secret. She had barely finished reading the spine when the entire wooden table, overburdened with books and decades of village gossip, collapsed with a startling crack. There was a scream, then another. And not because of falling paperbacks or dented knees, for underneath the skewed trestle and strewn paperbacks, barely visible beneath a collapsed crate of penny romances, was a man's lifeless body. The back of his head bore a dark crimson wound. He was sprawled on his side, his face twisted, as if in surprise. Mrs. Pendlebury clutched her chest and murmured something about having just fetched tea. Constable Rowntree, red in the face and wide in the middle, arrived with uncharacteristic urgency. The fairground air, once full of the scent of scones and mulled cider, grew stagnant with unease. Miss Marple, for her part, said nothing at first. She simply stepped back, eyes slightly narrowed. The man beneath the bookstall was unfamiliar to most. Dressed in city tweeds, with a wire-rimmed monocle now cracked beside him, he looked as out of place among the garden gnomes and blackberry cordial as a raven at a wedding. Miss Hartnell muttered something about a book valuer from London, but couldn't recall his name. By the time Dr. Finch arrived, looking like he'd rather be polishing his dahlias than examining a corpse, half the village was gathered near the yellow police tape made from boar. Road bunting, accident, someone ventured. Perhaps the stall just gave way. Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on a curious smear of ink on the man's left hand. Her attention then turned to the contents of the toppled table. Among the damp-edged gardening books and serialized romances lay a slim volume, oddly clean, The Last Confession of Elsie Harwood. She did not pick it up. Not yet. Instead, she asked gently, "Wasn't that book moved from the vestry donation box only last week?" Mrs. Pendlebury blinked. Yes, it was. How on earth did you know, Miss Marple?" "Oh, just a memory," she said, her voice light. "I remember because the vicar had placed it upside down, and it made a sort of point about humility." She smiled, demure and pleasant, but behind that smile, something had already shifted. The first breath of suspicion had crept in, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and unmistakable, like the rustle of lace in an empty room. And as the villagers speculated, as theories emerged as quickly as fresh scones from the Women's Institute oven, Miss Marple observed, she did not theorize aloud. Nor did she draw attention to herself. She merely watched with that quiet, unfailing eye that had, on more than one occasion, seen through the facade of politeness to the rot beneath. In Nether Whaddon, it was shaping up to be a most unpeaceful weekend. By the afternoon, the fairground had quieted into something unrecognizable. The bandstand, once echoing with cheerful brass, stood silent. The honey jars were packed away. There Sweetness no longer needed. Even the prize-winning Merrows sat neglected in their crates, like forgotten soldiers after a parade. Nether Wadden had slipped into its other skin. The one it wore only when death called. The body had been taken away. The bunting that served as makeshift police tape fluttered in the breeze like a village trying to remember its decorum. But nothing, not the brisk wind, nor the vicar's tentative reassurances could stop what came next. Gossip. It began in the corners of tea parlours and along garden hedges. Passed between fingers sticky from toffee and minds sharpened by familiarity. Everyone had seen something, or believed they had. Everyone had a theory, and as usual, none of them agreed. I heard it was a debt collector, murmured Mrs. Withers from behind the plum jam stand, as she polished a jar that had survived the morning. Chaos, from the city, came to press poor Sylvia for some taxes, or unpaid publishing fees, perhaps. You know how many years she's been hawking those second-hand paperbacks without a proper ledger. Rubbish, declared Mr. Hargreaves, the churchwarden, as he carefully arranged hymnals for the next morning's service despite no one asking him to. That man wasn't looking for Mrs. Pendlebury. He was watching the crowd like a bird of prey. I thought about it at the time, didn't I say, Margaret? Didn't I say he looked unnatural? Margaret, his long-suffering wife, nodded vaguely. He asked me where the chapel records were kept, said he was researching ecclesiastical donations or something. Sounded very official. He didn't have a village face. Miss Hartnell concluded darkly in the post office, stirring sugar into a tea. She hadn't paid for. Too many secrets in those eyes. Mark my words, he was here for something hidden. Miss Marple, sitting by the window of her neat cottage on Church Lane, sipped her tea and listened as the village pulsed with excitement and speculation. People meant well, she knew. But when a secret threatened to unravel, their tongues often moved faster than their understanding, and in Nether Wadden, secrets did not stay buried forever. The soil was too soft. She folded her hands in her lap and thought again of the book The Last Confession of Elsie Harwood. A curious title, unusually clean, amidst the chaos, and yet she had seen it before in the church's donation basket, just 1 week earlier. Why would a forgotten book make its way from a vestry corner to a place of prominence on a book? Stove. That collapsed beneath a man who had no business being there. And then there was the man himself. Dr. Finch had muttered something about the angle of the head wound, about the possibility that the man had already been injured before the fall. Miss Marple had caught that detail, though the good doctor likely hadn't meant to voice it so clearly. Still, she held the thought without chasing it. Not yet. Instead, she penned a short note in her private journaling stain on left-hand unfamiliar man, spectacles broken, city dress book Elsie Harwood recently moved. Vicar placed it upside down memory test. Mrs. Pendlebury had left stall. Minutes earlier was the table meant to collapse or merely used. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was the vicar, Reverend Chiswick, his face drawn, his clerical collar unusually askew. Miss Marple, I forgive the intrusion. She gestured him inside, already pouring him a cup of tea. I imagine your afternoon has been rather unsettled, she offered gently. He exhaled. That would be an understatement. I'm afraid the police will have questions for all of us. They've taken the guest ledger from the hall and asked for a list of recent donations to the chapel's book drive. Oh, Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost amused. I imagine they're wondering if the man came in with one of the donations, or for one, he said, his brow creased, apparently. The detective sergeant thinks he may have been searching for a specific book. They're asking whether anything valuable might have been included by mistake. A first edition, perhaps, she said thoughtfully, or a journal. People sometimes don't realize the significance of what they donate. He hesitated. Miss Marple, I must admit something odd. Yesterday morning, I noticed the Harwood book was missing. I assumed someone had taken it to the stall early. she said, but it hadn't been catalogued yet, had it? No, and I distinctly remember setting it aside. It contained a handwritten note inside a pressed violet and a date. That startled her more than she let on. How curious. Do you think it has anything to do with the man's death? I think, said Miss Marple, her eyes sharpening for just a moment, that anything involving handwriting and violets rarely ends without consequence. The vicar blinked. You really do believe it's connected? I believe, she said softly, that the man's presence in our village was no accident, and if he died with a book in his hand, we must ask not only why he came but what he hopes to find. That evening, Constable Rowntree, stout and nervous, made his rounds knocking on the doors of those nearest the bookstall. He questioned Mrs. Pendlebury, who was still in mild hysterics and couldn't recall whether she'd seen the man before. He interviewed young Timothy Craig, who had been helping her carry boxes that morning. Timothy insisted he had gone to fetch a sausage roll when the table collapsed. At the edge of the green, the village children, already forbidden from playing near the scene, had begun referring to the man as the book ghost. Their whispers carried into windows, borne on the twilight wind. And somewhere in all of this, a memory stirred in Miss Marple's mind. The name Elsie Harwood. She had heard it before, not in a book, but in connection to a scandal some years back. A governess in Kent, dismissed under unpleasant circumstances. A matter involving misplaced trust and an unfortunate diary. Miss Marple stood, crossed to her sideboard, and pulled open a drawer that held a modest collection of village newsletters and cuttings. She did not need forensic archives. A paragraph in a 1948 edition of the Chipping Down Herald confirmed that Elsie Harwood, formerly employed at the Thornler estate, was quietly dismissed following concerns raised over the publication of a personal memoir found circulating among domestic staff. She tapped the clipping once, thoughtfully. A memoir, a confession, and now, years later, a death. Outside, the wind lifted the edge of the bunting still tied to the broken bookstall. It fluttered like a flag marking a forgotten battlefield, and within her mind, the pieces, slow, careful, unhurried, began to shift into place. The next morning dawned brisk and cool, with the last of the summer warmth giving way to the faintest whisper of autumn. Mist drifted low over the hedgerows, and the spire of St. Mildred's gleamed pale and damp in the light, yet even the dew could not quiet the low hum of unease that had settled over Nether Whaddon. Though the harvest fair had ended in disaster, its aftermath lingered like a scent in the curtains. Church bells rang more solemnly than usual, and the pews were fuller than expected. Even Mr. Hargreaves refrained from his usual tutting at the vicar's sermon length, and when the choir sang the closing hymn, their voices had a tentative edge, as though wary of discord. Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual place beneath the stained glass window of St. Mildred and listened, her gaze drifting toward the lectern where the book donations had once been stacked for the women's guild. The place now stood empty. Later, outside the light gate, the congregation clumped together in reluctant knots, speaking in the exaggerated hush reserved for both funerals and scandals. No one quite knew what to say. And so they said everything. He was asking about the Thornleys, whispered Mrs. Quimby, an energetic woman of advanced gossiping skills. I heard he'd gone round to the old carriage house last week. I passed him near the green, chimed in Cyril Finch, the doctor's nephew. He asked me if Elsie Harwood had ever returned to the village. Elsie Harwood, I barely remember her name. Left in disgrace, didn't she? Poor Sylvia, someone murmured about Mrs. Pendlebury. Imagine the stall falling like that, could have been her under it. Miss Marple did not interrupt, she rarely did. Instead, she turned to speak to a figure lingering a few steps away. Mabel Crowthorne, a widow of precise habits and sharp, deliberate words. Do you remember Miss Harwood? Mabel glanced at her with something close to surprise. Elsie Harwood. Yes, good heavens, yes, I do, but I hadn't thought of her in years. Rather sudden departure, wasn't it? Mabel's lips pinched, quiet. She was governess at Thornlow Hall during that dreadful business with the letters. Some thought she wrote them, others suspected someone wanted her out of the way. And she left no trace, asked Miss Marple, her tone light as a passing cloud, Mabel's voice lowered. There was talk that she moved abroad, or married into some quiet obscurity. But then most people preferred not to remember. The Thornleys sold the estate soon after. Strange, Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself, that her name should return to us only now in a book. That afternoon, as the sun strained to emerge from behind thick, cottony clouds, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Pendlebury. The poor woman had not returned to the bookstall but was sitting in a faded armchair beside a cold fireplace, holding a handkerchief she never used. I can't make sense of it, Sylvia said. After a pause in which she had recounted the incident twice and offered Miss Marple a stale biscuit, he was just there. I came back with tea and the sound of it. The table splintered. Miss Marple gently touched the edge of the woman's sleeve. Did he speak to you at all? Sylvia shook her head. Not a word, though he'd been there, I think, before it happened. I thought I saw him glance over the books oddly, because he didn't look like the type to care for romances. And the table itself, Miss Marple's voice was soft but deliberate. It had never collapsed before. Never. Timothy Craik helps me set it up every year. The legs were braced, at least I believe they were. Did he set it up that morning? Sylvia hesitated. Yes, though he was late. Said he was helping his uncle unload preserves. Miss Marple nodded slowly, making a note to follow up on that detail. And the books, she added. Did you select which ones came with you to the fair? Oh yes, I sort them every year. I try to bring a mix. That Elsie Harwood one I nearly didn't include. It felt too personal to intimate, but you did, Sylvia blinked. Well, no, I'd left it out. That's the strange part. I placed it on my kitchen sideboard with the others to stay behind. But there it was, right at the front of the table. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. You're quite sure? Absolutely. I remember, because the pressed violet inside startled me. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a careful clink. Pressed flowers can carry remarkable weight, she said, especially when someone wants to preserve something they're not yet willing to speak aloud. That evening, in the fading golden light, Miss Marple walked slowly along the edge of the green. The site of the bookstall had been cleared. Nothing remained but a few scuffs in the grass and a white thread of ribbon tangled in a hedgerow. She turned when she heard footsteps approaching. It was young Timothy Craik. Jacket slung over one shoulder, his face flushed from walking. Miss Marple, he said with an awkward tug of his cap. I hear you've been asking questions. Oh, she replied gently, only the sort that arises when someone dies under curious circumstances. I didn't see much, he said quickly. Just helped set up. The table was heavy. That's all. Of course, she said, though it does puzzle me. The table was sound for years. For it to collapse now, with just one man leaning over it, seems unexpected. Timothy's eyes flickered. Maybe he leaned too far, or maybe the leg was loose. Maybe, said Miss Marple, letting the word hang, and perhaps someone nudged it, ever so slightly. He turned to go, then paused. You think he was after that book? I think, Miss Marple said quietly, he came to this village with questions, and now he's left behind more of his own. She watched him go, then looked down at the object in her hand, a torn scrap of paper she had found near the hedge. Was a corner of a page, brittle and yellowed, with just 4 words visible. And I forgive you. The handwriting was fine, almost feminine, and below it, faintly, was the impression of a petal once pressed between the folds. She folded the paper away into her handbag and turned back toward the village. The past, she had often found, never remained buried, not when someone was determined to dig it up. And in Nether Wharton, someone had done exactly that by Monday morning. Inspector Graves had arrived from the county station at Milchester, his reputation preceding him like the distant sound of a kettle about to boil. Tall, methodical, and favouring waistcoats with fob watches. Graves carried an air of assurance well suited to a man who preferred to deal with murders in cities rather than sleepy villages with clipped hedges and marmalade competitions, but Nether Wharton, as Miss Marple often reflected, was never as quiet as it seemed. Graves began with the body, of course the dead man, now identified as Mr. Clement Goswood, had lodged at the Hare and Barrel, the only inn in the village with hot water and curtains thick enough to please out-of-town sensibilities. His arrival had gone largely unnoticed by the locals, an easy feat in a place where most people still posted handwritten notes through doors rather than using the telephone. "He signed the register on Wednesday," said Mr. Drakitt, the innkeeper, peering over his bifocals. "Didn't say much, said he was researching the local monograph. I didn't pry. Did he have any callers?" asked Graves, pen poised. "None that I saw. Went out each morning, came back late. Took his meals alone, quiet sort." Miss Marple, who had happened to be delivering a jar of plum preserves that morning as a small courtesy to Mrs. Drakitt, who was recovering from a twisted ankle, offered a gentle cough. "If I may, Inspector," Graves turned, eyeing her with a mix of curiosity and restraint. He had heard of Miss Marple. Everyone in the local constabulary had, though she was spoken of with fondness. There was also wariness in those who'd once found their carefully constructed theories unravelled by her quiet deductions. "Yes, Miss Marple, I believe Mr. Goswood was not merely researching the monograph. He was searching for something or someone with rather more personal implications. Indeed." She offered the pressed violet she had preserved in wax paper, along with the torn scrap bearing the partial phrase. Graves examined them without comment, but the narrowing of his eyes betrayed a flicker of interest. "Where did you find this?" "Near the hedge behind the bookstall. I believe it may have come from the book The Last Confession of Elsie Harwood, the same book Mr. Goswood was seen near before he died." "You think the two are connected? I find it unlikely to be a coincidence," she said delicately. "And as I'm sure you're aware, Inspector, pressed flowers are often used as markers or as ways to conceal correspondence in volumes one does not wish others to find." Graves tucked the paper carefully into a small evidence envelope. "We'll follow that line, certainly." "Thank you." Miss Marple inclined her head. "If I may also suggest looking into Mr. Goswood's professional background. I have reason to believe he was not merely a collector of rare books, but rather someone involved in, let us say, literary clean-ups. A man who found sensitive documents and ensured they vanished." Graves did not smile, but the corner of his lip twitched. "You believe this was no ordinary murder?" "I believe," she said softly, "that when a confession emerges from a past scandal, especially one involving a disgraced governess and a noble family, it rarely leads to something ordinary." Later that day, Graves paid a visit to the local records office in Milchester. There, aided by a diligent clerk named Miss Turner, he uncovered a slim file on Clement Goswood. Goswood had once worked under contract for several private libraries and estate clearances. His specialty had been family-sensitive documents and literary appraisals. He had worked, interestingly enough, on the dispersal of books from the Thornler estate after its sale in 1949. Graves tapped his pen against the desk. So he knew Elsie Harwood's name. Miss Turner adjusted her spectacles. Quite possibly. There's a note here, Harwood Papers pending review. Confidential. And where were those papers taken? She consulted a ledger. Some went to the Milchester Historical Society. Others to private hands. Graves sat back. Something stirred behind the facts. Something shadowed. Meanwhile, in Nether Wodden, Miss Marple took a very different approach. She walked, slowly and without ceremony, to the cottage of Agnes Blunt, a quiet, retired schoolmistress with an impeccable memory and a lifelong habit of keeping to herself. Agnes was not known for gossiping, but she remembered everything. Oh yes, Agnes said, after Miss Marple asked gently about Elsie Harwood. I remember the girl, plain thing, smart, far too observant for her own good. She used to sit in the back pew at church and never looked up from her Bible. She left after that, unpleasantness. Miss Marple prompted. Agnes nodded. There were whispers of a romance someone above her station. I won't repeat names, but I believe she was betrayed, quite cruelly. Was it true she wrote a diary? Agnes hesitated. It was more than a diary. She wrote stories, fictionalized, but close to the bone. One piece mentioned a garden bench and a pressed violet. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Was it ever published? Not officially, but one copy, I heard, was made and hidden. There were fears it might become a scandal. The Thornley name, you see, they paid to have it buried. Miss Marple left shortly after, offering her thanks and a small gift of lavender soap. By evening, a new visitor had arrived in the village. A tall, angular woman with greying blonde hair, dressed in severe navy, asked for directions to the vicarage. She introduced herself as Mrs. Emery from Kent. I came, she said, in a low voice, because I saw something in the local paper, a mention of a man found dead. I believe he was looking for me. Reverend Chiswick, quite taken aback, offered her a seat and sent for Miss Marple. When she arrived, Mrs. Emery turned pale. You knew him? Miss Marple asked gently. I did, the woman said, voice trembling. His name was Clement. He contacted me last month, saying he had found something belonging to me. I thought it was a bluff, but then he sent me a copy of a page. She retrieved it from her handbag. It was unmistakably the same handwriting as the scrap Miss Marple had found. I was Elsie Harwood, the woman said, and for a long moment the room held its breath. I changed my name after I left England. I am married. I swore never to return. But when that letter came, I knew someone had found my past. I came to make peace, and now he's dead. Miss Marple's eyes, soft and steady, did not flicker. Then, I believe, she said gently, we must ask who else knew you were coming, and who stood to lose if that confession ever became public. Outside, the evening bells rang once. The air in Nether Wodden, which had for days smelled of ripened pears and dried hay, now carried the faintest trace of something else, of secrets too long held, and of someone willing to kill to keep them. For the next day and a half, the village of Nether Wodden appeared, to the casual observer, much like itself, hedges neatly trimmed, lace curtains drawn at just the right angle, and chickens in orderly coops along Upper Lane. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. It was not only that a stranger had died on parish grounds, or that whispers of a decades-old scandal were beginning to float back into the polite conversation of bake sales and flower shows. It was the peculiar sense that some people known for being mild and unremarkable were suddenly walking a little faster, looking over their shoulders a little more often, speaking in clipped tones when names like Elsie or Thornley were mentioned. Miss Marple, however, had long understood the art of listening not only to what was said, but to what was not. And what was not being said had grown louder with each passing hour. Mrs. Emery, formerly Elsie Harwood, had taken refuge in the vicarage's small guest room, reluctant to appear in the village. She kept the shutters closed and drank her tea. in slow, measured sips, as though each cup brought her closer to something inevitable, when Miss Marple visited her the next morning. She found the woman sitting with a small stack of yellowed correspondence in her lap. Their copies, Elsie said without preamble, her voice hoarse, of letters I wrote to Frederick Thornler in the year before I left. I kept them. I shouldn't have, but I did, I suppose I thought. If I ever needed to explain myself, they would speak for me. Miss Marple took one gently, her gloved fingers brushing against the fragile paper. The handwriting was elegant but fervent. The closing lines were unmistakable. I will not be shamed into silence. If you will not defend me, I will do it myself. Elsie watched her. I never sent that one. But the others, they were meant to be private. I never imagined they'd end up in someone else's hands. And you believe Mr. Goswood had found them? Elsie nodded. He claimed he had access to a trunk from the Thornler estate, said it had been sold to a collector after the house was emptied. He told me he found a literary curiosity and thought it might be worth publishing. I suppose he hoped I would pay to stop it. But you came anyway. I had to. I wanted to see the pages myself. I don't know what I thought. But now he's dead. And someone must have seen the danger before I did. Miss Marple studied her for a moment, then asked gently, did Mr. Goswood say who else knew about the papers? No, he was careful. Outside, the church bell chimed for half an hour. Miss Marple stood, smoothing the front of her skirt. Then it seems we must consider who else stood to lose something should your letters, or your name, reappear. She left Mrs. Emery in silence and walked the path that curved along the old boundary wall of Thornler Hall. The estate itself had long since been sold, divided, and rebuilt into 3 handsome homes, one for a barrister, another for a retired naval officer, and the third, curiously enough, now occupied by Mrs. Audrey Whiting, a former companion to Lady Thornler herself. Mrs. Whiting was a woman of brittle manners and razor-sharp cheekbones. When Miss Marple arrived under the pretence of delivering rose-scented soap for the harvest raffle, she was invited into a drawing-room that smelled faintly of camphor and aged perfume. I heard you had a visitor, Miss Marple said lightly as they sat. Mrs. Whiting's eyes narrowed. You mean that woman at the vicarage? I've heard the whispers. Quite disgraceful, digging up old history like that. We had peace in this village. Peace, Miss Marple echoed. Or silence. Mrs. Whiting's jaw tensed. It's always the same, isn't it? Some poor girl thinks she's been wronged and starts scribbling things that should never be read. Aloud, she was dismissed. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't, Miss Marple said softly. No, because someone with no regard for decency let those papers escape. I told Lady Thornler we ought to have burned them all. But she wanted everything boxed, properly archived. She said, Justin, Case, did you help with that? I supervised the packing. I made sure no servants had access. And I distinctly remember sealing the trunk myself. But once it was sold, who knows what happened? And yet you remained nearby. Mrs. Whiting's gaze flicked away. Lady Thornler left me a small inheritance and the right to remain on the grounds. I took the house after the renovations. It was familiar. Miss Marple gave a small, courteous smile when she returned to her cottage. She opened her notebook and added several more lines. Beneath the earlier entries, Mrs. Whiting supervised archive letters confirmed real by Elsie motivation to surprise. S. Contents Frederick Thornler equals probable. Name in letters if Goswood sought publication. Whom did he contact? That question stayed with her throughout the evening. Not who killed Clement Goswood, but who was contacted by him before he died, who had something to lose if the story of Elsie Harwood, governess-turned-scapegoat, ever reached print? The answer came not in words, but in action. The next morning, the vicarage maid discovered that someone had broken into the vestry. Nothing had been taken, except for a single book. The last confession of Elsie Harwood. It had been resting on a shelf left after the fair for safekeeping. Now it is gone. Miss Marple arrived within the hour, called by the vicar's urgent knock. She examined the shelf, the window latch which had been forced, and the small footprint in the soil beneath the sill. An amateur, she murmured, likely someone desperate, but not entirely foolish. Why that book? Reverend Chiswick asked, exasperated. Because it holds something the killer could not leave behind. A page, a letter, a reference, something identifying. But it was already examined, wasn't it, by the police? Yes. But perhaps not carefully enough. And the killer wouldn't take that risk. She paused, then added, I believe the killer did not intend to murder Mr. Garswood. Not at first, but when the threat became real. The only way to bury the past was to bury the man bringing it, later. That day, she walked to the edge of the green again, where the bookstall had collapsed. She looked down at the grass, now flattened and regrowing in patches. The scene was quiet again. She could almost see the moment a man leaning over, searching. Through the books, perhaps even spotting the one he came for. Someone approaches, words are exchanged. A warning, perhaps. Then, a blow swift and unplanned, the table tips, books scatter, blood stains the grass, but not everything was scattered. Someone had retrieved what they needed, and now one book has vanished completely. Miss Marple looked up. The village stretched before her like a painting held in place too long. Someone among them was hoping to rewrite history. But she, more than anyone, understood some stories will not stay buried. Tuesday morning arrived with a kind of crisp defiance as though the sky, in its cool clarity, wished to wash away the unease still settled over Nether Whaddon. But clarity of weather, Miss Marple well knew, rarely meant clarity of truth. At the vicarage, breakfast was interrupted by a knock at the door. Reverend Chiswick, tying the belt of his worn housecoat, opened it to find Inspector Graves standing. With his notebook and a frown, Reverend, he said without preamble, we've just confirmed what Miss Marple suspected. The stolen book from your vestry, the last confession of Elsie Harwood, contained a folded letter. It was missed during initial inspection because it had been tucked into a false spine lining, likely a recent addition. There's adhesive residue consistent with someone altering the book after it was already at the fair. The vicar blinked, but then whoever placed it there knew its significance. Graves nodded, and whoever stole it knew that someone else might find it too. Miss Marple, seated in the small breakfast room with her teacup half raised, set it down very gently, so it wasn't simply the presence of the book that mattered, she said softly. It was what had been planted inside it. A message. Graves opened his notebook. The letter was signed with initials only FT. The contents are vague, emotional, not incriminating, but they mention our meetings in the orchard and reference a violet ribbon. It's dated 1947. Reverend Chiswick looked at Miss Marple. Startled. EFT, surely that must be Frederick Thornler. It seems likely, she murmured, though in this village, assumptions can be costly. The inspector sighed. We're tracing Garswood's last telephone calls. He used the payphone at the Hare and Barrel the day before he died. One call to Kent, another to Milchester. And oddly enough one to a number registered to a Mrs. Audrey Whitting, Miss Marple's. Fingers paused over her saucer. Did she admit to it, reluctantly? Claims he rang her, asking if she remembered what happened to the girl. She says she hung up, but I rather think she knew more than she let on. The doorbell rang again. This time it was young Timothy Craik, cap in hand, shifting nervously. On the stone step, begging your pardon, Reverend, I found something near the footpath behind our shed. I didn't know whether it was important, but after what happened. He handed the vicar a sealed envelope, slightly damp and smudged but intact. The vicar passed it to Graves, who slit it open carefully. Inside was a torn half-page of cream writing paper. The ink was faded, but legible, never meant to betray. You, Elsie, they said it would ruin the family, but I see now I was a coward. If this letter finds its way to you, know that I remember the bench, the violet, everything. The signature was absent, but the sentiment was unmistakably intimate. Timothy shifted again. It was in the hedge, sir, just lying there, probably dropped when whoever broke in made it through the gardens. Miss Marple thanked him quietly and asked one small question. Was anyone else on the path that evening? Timothy scratched his head. Well, I did see someone walking fast, about dusk, tall, dark coat. I assumed it was Dr. Finch, but then again could have been the inspector, or even Mr. Hargreaves. Miss Marple gave a slight nod. Quite right not to assume. Later that day, Miss Marple requested a quiet word with Inspector Graves. They met in the back corner of the parish library, where no one had browsed for nearly a decade. I have a suggestion, she said, as they walked among dusty shelves. Let the village think you've identified the killer. Announce it quietly. But make certain it spreads through the usual channels. Mrs. Withers, the grocer, the ladies at the W.I. Say you suspect a stranger Mr. Garswood met in Milchester. Nothing more. Graves raised an eyebrow. And what would that achieve? It'd make us someone to relax, she said calmly. To make a mistake. Graves nodded slowly. You want the killer to think the danger has passed. Exactly, she replied. Let them believe. They've buried the past once more. That night, the news did indeed trickle through the village like slow syrup. Garswood's death, it was said, was now thought to be connected to an old dispute in Milchester, possibly financial, certainly nothing to concern Nether Whaddon. The villagers clucked their tongues, offered sighs of relief, and returned to their routines, all except one. At 9:30 that evening, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her parlour, the radio murmuring a chamber music programme, when a soft knock came at her door. She rose and opened it to find Mrs. Audrey Whiting standing there, gloved and pale. I don't know why I've come, the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think you do, said Miss Marple, stepping aside. Please, come in. Mrs. Whiting removed her gloves mechanically and sat stiffly in the armchair across from the fire. She looked older than she had earlier that week, thinner somehow, as if the weight of years had returned all at once. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, she said, her fingers trembling. He came to my door, days before the fair, said he knew who I was, what I had done. He had the letters, or said he did. Clement Garswood, Miss Marple said gently. Yes. I told him to leave, that he didn't understand the harm he was doing. He said he'd already made arrangements to deliver the confession to someone at the fair. If he couldn't get payment, he'd see to it that it was aired in full. And so you followed him, Miss Marple prompted, quietly. I watched him from the crowd, Mrs. Whiting whispered. He had the book in his hands. I knew what was inside. I thought I could snatch it, slip it away, destroy it, but something went wrong. He recognized me, he said. You should have spoken for her. And then he turned away, and I only meant to stop him, to pull the book from him. But he staggered. He was near the edge of the bookstall and it tipped. It wasn't planned. Miss Marple did not flinch. And the letter in the vestry? I retrieved it that night. I thought no one had noticed. I burned most of it, but a page must have fallen. For a long moment, the two women sat in silence, the fire crackling gently. I was afraid, Mrs. Whiting said. I didn't want to lose everything again. You had already lost something long ago. Miss Marple replied, but it wasn't your reputation. The clock ticked once, then again, and the truth, unburied at last, settled between them like dust from a forgotten book. The morning after Mrs. Whiting's midnight visit, the village of Nether Whaddon woke to the brittle hush of early frost. Though the sun glimmered faintly on the chapel roof and smoke curled sleepily from cottage chimneys, something in the air had shifted. Miss Marple rose early. She moved about her kitchen with familiar efficiency, spooning out marmalade, setting out to teacups one, a habit of years past, and folding the newspaper with delicate precision. Though the village had not yet heard the truth, Miss Marple knew it wouldn't remain hidden for long. News always travelled faster than a motorcar when regret was behind the wheel. She did not contact Inspector Graves that morning. She knew he would arrive when he needed to. Until then, she returned to the little notepad on her writing desk, where the whole thing had been quietly recorded in her slanted hand. Gaswood blackmailed Elsie. Harwood also contacted Mrs. Whiting. Attempted public exposure via Bookstall. Struggle equals accidental death. Cover-up via vestry. Break-in. Book retrieved. Evidence destroyed. Motive equals shame. Not money. Guilt equals shared, but not equal at 10 o'clock sharp. Inspector Graves appeared at her garden gate. He did not wait to be invited in, but gave her a brief nod and stepped across the threshold with his usual economy of movement. His eyes, usually cool and appraising, were tired. "She came to me last night," Miss Marple said simply, though not to confess outright. "I imagine she still hopes it might be classified as an accident." Graves gave a short breath, not quite a sigh. "And was it?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I believe it was a moment of panic, but not an innocent one. Mrs. Whiting has spent over 30 years preserving a reputation built atop another woman's ruin. She knew the contents of the letters. She helped suppress them. And when the chance came to erase them for good, she took it, perhaps not with malice, but certainly with purpose." Graves sat across from her, silent for a long time. "She agreed to speak to me," he said at last, "but she's requested it be at the vicarage. A curious choice," Miss Marple mused. "She says it's the one place Elsie Harwood wasn't allowed to enter back then. She wants to put that right." By mid-morning, the vicarage drawing-room had been quietly repurposed. Reverend Chiswick, slightly alarmed by the request, but trusting in Miss Marple's assurance, made tea and withdrew discreetly. The clock on the mantel ticked evenly as Mrs. Whiting sat opposite Inspector Graves. Her back straight and her fingers wrapped tightly around her handbag, Miss Marple stood by the window, watching the last of the leaves fall from the maple tree in the garden. "I should have spoken up years ago," Mrs. Whiting said. Her voice was steady but hoarse. "I was Lady Thornley's companion for 12 years. I knew all her secrets, including the one she never admitted aloud, that her son Frederick had seduced the governess and abandoned her when it suited him." Graves said nothing, letting her continue. "I saw the letters," she said. "I read every one, and I told Lady Thornley they had to be destroyed. But she was sentimental in her way. She thought perhaps someday the girl might return and ask forgiveness, or that Frederick would, so she boxed everything, labelled it spiritual property. If you can believe it." Miss Marple spoke softly from the window. "But he never did return, did he?" "No," said Mrs. Whiting. "Frederick died abroad, a car accident, in Milan, 1954, and so the papers stayed hidden," Graves said, "until the estate was broken up." Mrs. Whiting nodded. "By then, Lady Thornley was gone. I supervised the packing. I remember the box clearly, but I never thought it would resurface." "But it did," said Miss Marple. "Through Mr. Gaswood." Mrs. Whiting's face tightened. "He came to me 3 days before the fair. He said he'd found something rare, a buried confession, he called it. I told him to go. He said he was going to show it to Elsie. Said it was time she knew the truth. And so you went to the fair?" Graves prompted. "Yes," she said. "I only meant to intercept him, to take the book before he could hand it over. But when he saw me, he recognized me, called me a coward, said, 'You let her suffer while you smiled at communion.' I panicked. I reached for the book, he backed away. The table tipped. She covered her mouth briefly. "I didn't mean for him to fall." "But you didn't call for help," Graves said quietly. "No," she whispered. I picked up the book and walked away. Miss Marple turned then, her voice as calm as falling snow, "And in doing so, you chose once again to protect your past over someone else's peace." There was silence. At last, Graves stood. "We'll have to make a formal statement. The Crown may see it as manslaughter and unintentional death during a criminal act. The cover-up will weigh heavier." Mrs. Whiting did not respond. She sat quietly, her face turned to the window. After Graves departed with her in his car, Reverend Chiswick emerged from the hallway. "Looking pale, she was in the choir," he murmured. "She sang next to my sister for years." Miss Marple closed the parlour door behind them. "We often forget, dear Reverend, that guilt has a way of dressing itself in hymns and biscuits." By evening, the village had heard that a statement had been made, though few understood the full story. Mrs. Whiting, it was said, had taken a sudden illness and gone to stay with relatives in Bath. No one asked too many questions, and at the vicarage, Mrs. Emery Elsie Harwood stood once more in the empty chapel, staring at the lectern that had once barred her entry. This time, she walked past it to the front pew. Miss Marple watched from the back. Unseen, Elsie knelt quietly, then rose, her spine straight. She did not look behind her as she left. That night, Miss Marple recorded the last line in her notebook. "Justice delayed is not always denied." She set her pen down, folded her hands, and turned off the lamp. Outside, the frost returned. But inside, something long frozen had begun at last to thaw. 2 days passed, and though the air in Nether Whaddon remained crisp and edged with the scent of wood smoke, the mood of the village had subtly changed. There was a kind of collective exhale, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. The gossip, while still swirling in corners and kitchens, had softened from the fevered whispers of accusation to the quiet murmur of retrospective sympathy. But Miss Marple, as ever, was not one to exhale too soon. Though the tragedy at the bookstall had reached its apparent resolution, Mrs. Audrey Whiting's confession, and her discreet removal to a private facility in Bath, there remained, in Miss Marple's careful mind, a thread not yet fully woven into the fabric of truth, and it had to do with the book itself. The original copy of the last confession of Elsie Harwood, thought to be destroyed, had never been officially recovered. Mrs. Whiting had claimed she retrieved it during the vestry break-in and burned it at her hearth, but no ashes had been found, and no fragments. Inspector Graves, perhaps satisfied with the confession itself, had not pursued the matter further. Miss Marple, however, had a lingering suspicion. On Thursday afternoon, she visited the Hare and Barrel under the guise of taking tea with Mrs. Draycott, who by then had returned to her post behind the reception counter, her ankle wrapped in bandages and her opinion of London men thoroughly darkened. He stayed in room 3, she told Miss Marple between sips of Darjeeling, quiet as a mouse, never asked for extra towels, and left hardly a dent in the mattress. Though he did leave behind one thing, Miss Marple raised a brow. Mrs. Draycott fetched a slim parcel wrapped in brown paper from the drawer behind the desk. He checked out of the room the morning of the fair, but left this under the floorboard. "Our cleaning girl found it yesterday. I was just about to turn it over to the constable." Miss Marple accepted the parcel with care. It was light, but dense. The paper crackled under her fingers as she unwrapped it. Inside was a notebook, hand-bound, no publisher's markings. The first page read, in neat cursive ink, "The last confession of Elsie Harwood, privately compiled for truth's sake." Miss Marple turned the pages slowly. It was all there, a memoir in pieces, written in the voice of a young woman trapped between duty and disgrace. Names were changed, but not obscured. Events described with both precision and aching restraint. And at the end, a final entry if this ever sees the light of day. It will not be because I have asked for pity, but perhaps someone someday will see what it costs to keep things silent, and how long a lie can echo in the corridors of respectability. Below it was a single pressed violet. Miss Marple closed the book. Gently, it seems, she said to Mrs. Drake that not all truths wish to be burned. She left the inn and walked directly to the vicarage. There, in the study, she found Reverend Chiswick preparing his sermon on forgiveness for the coming Sunday. He looked up, surprised by the serious expression on Miss Marple's usually serene face. "I need your help," she said without preamble. "I have something that belongs to Elsie Harwood." The vicar took the book, cradling it as though it were a fragile hymn. "She never asked for this to be read," Miss Marple said, "but I believe, in coming back, she hoped someone would bear witness, quietly, without spectacle." Chiswick nodded, the weight of the object clear in his hands. "What would you have me do?" "Return it to her," she said. "No questions, no announcements, just give it back." That evening, the vicar walked the narrow lane to the cottage where Elsie, still Mrs. Emery, to most, was staying. He delivered the book in silence, and she accepted it without surprise, only a quiet tightening of the lips. When he left, she stood for a long moment at the window, the book unopened, resting in her palm, and then, slowly, she sat down and began to read. The next morning, Miss Marple received a letter on pale lavender stationery. "My dear Miss Marple, it seems you've returned something I once thought lost forever. Not just the words, but the strength behind them. There are things I may never reclaim, but knowing that someone saw the whole truth, that is a comfort beyond anything I imagined. I shall be leaving Netherwooden soon, but not in shame this time. In peace, yours, E.H. Miss Marple folded the letter, placed it beside her morning saucer, and allowed herself the briefest of smiles. Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves arrived unannounced, hat in hand, as if summoned by some invisible signal. "I hear you found the missing book," he said. "I have," Miss Marple replied, offering him tea. "Though it is no longer missing. Is it incriminating in a legal sense? Perhaps not. But in a human sense profoundly." Graves leaned back in his chair. "You never cease to surprise me, Miss Marple." She gave a faint shrug. "Human nature, Inspector. Most people are very much the same when you know what to look for. Pride and fear have caused more ruin than all the poisons in the world." He nodded slowly. As he stood to go, she added, "And yet, now and then, a truth is preserved, pressed between pages like a violet, faded, perhaps, but still fragrant with memory." That evening, as dusk wrapped its soft fingers around the village, the green stood empty again. No fair stalls, no crowds, just the hush of autumn leaves brushing one another like turning pages. At her window, Miss Marple watched the shadows lengthen and turned her face to the fading light. Not every story ended with applause or justice as a headline. Some ended with a returned letter, a closed book, a new breath taken after years of silence, and that, in its own way, was justice enough. By the following weekend, Netherwooden had slipped back into its familiar rhythms: church bells on Sunday, garden forks clinking against soil, and the soft clatter of teacups at Mrs. Withers's Wednesday gathering. Yet beneath the surface of clotted cream and well-trimmed hedges, something in the village had changed. A quiet hush now lingered behind conversations. Not awkward, but reflective, like the stillness after a storm has passed, when everyone is slightly altered by the air. Miss Marple noticed it most in the way people greeted one another. A longer pause before speaking, a flicker of something unreadable behind even the most familiar eyes. It was the kind of change that could only be felt, not named. The collapse of the bookstall no longer made headlines. Nor did the name Clement Garswood travel freely through drawing rooms. Mrs. Audrey Whitting's departure had been accepted without ceremony. Some said she'd gone to Bath for her nerves, others guessed a quiet health matter, but no one pressed. Not now, Elsie Harwood, still Mrs. Emery to those who respected her silence. Remained in the village a few days longer, she did not attend church, but she could be seen walking the green at dusk, hands tucked into her sleeves, her expression unreadable. Once, Miss Marple passed her in the lane. Their eyes met. Nothing was said. But at that moment, everything was understood. It was during this interlude of near peace that another letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. It came not by post, but slipped discreetly through her letterbox, the edges of the envelope still carrying the faintest scent of dried lavender. Inside was a folded sheet of parchment. No signature, no return address. I was there the day she left. I was the one who watched from behind the parlour curtains as she packed her case and walked alone down the drive. No one stopped her. No one even pretended to look out the window. But I remember the way she held her head, as if daring the world to judge her. I was just a maid, then 18. Told to keep quiet, but I never forgot. I never meant to keep the book. I only meant to hold onto something that proved she had lived. Beneath the letter was a single pressed violet, brittle now, nearly translucent with age. Miss Marple placed the letter gently beside the others in her bureau drawer. Then she went to her garden and clipped a fresh violet from the patch near the stone wall. The flowers were late blooming this season, clinging on despite the approaching frost. Later that morning, she walked the narrow lane to the post office. The road was quiet. The trees shedding leaves with slow dignity, she carried with her. Parcel modest, brown wrapped, tied with twine. Inside was the fresh violet, enclosed in wax paper, and a note: no matter how carefully some things are buried, they grow roots. She addressed it simply Mrs. Emery C. Oh, the old vicarage. Nether Whaddon personal to be delivered by hand. She handed it to young Rosie Braddock at the counter, who promised, with wide eyes, to take it straight to the Reverend. When she returned home, Miss Marple settled into her parlour chair, pulled her shawl over her shoulders, and resumed her knitting. A gentle knock came just before tea time. Elsie stood at the door, holding the parcel, her eyes softer now, less guarded. You sent this? She asked. Miss Marple nodded, rising slowly. Only what was never said at the time. Elsie looked down at the flower, now sitting in her open palm. You know, she said quietly, he once told me violets meant secrecy. In the language of flowers, they do, Miss Marple agreed. But also faithfulness, memory, the kind of love that doesn't vanish just because it's hidden. They stood in silence. Then Elsie said, I've decided to go back to Kent. There's a small house by the coast I used to visit in the summers. I think it's time I lived without hiding. Miss Marple stepped aside. Would you like to come in? No, Elsie smiled faintly. I only wanted to say thank you. Miss Marple nodded. Then let me say something as well. You were never lost, Elsie. Just misfiled, like a letter that arrives too late, but still matters. Elsie swallowed, blinked once, and turned to go as she walked down the path. The light caught the edge of her coat, and for a moment it seemed to shimmer like something newly washed of sorrow. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the flames casting soft shadows on the lace curtains. She reflected not on the murder, though it had been dreadful in its way, but on what had preceded it. The silencing of a girl, the fear of scandal, the protection of appearances at the cost of truth. She thought of all the times people had turned their heads, the moments when someone might have said, that's not right, and didn't, and she thought, too, of the quiet ways people remember, pressed violets, anonymous notes, a book passed hand to hand. Miss Marple reached for her notebook once more. She did not often indulge in philosophy, but that night she wrote a single line beneath the case's closing summary. The truth, like a flower, may be pressed flat, but it is never erased. She closed the notebook, set it aside, and poured herself a second cup of tea. Outside, the stars had begun to prick the sky, one by one, and somewhere, a woman who had once been erased now walked into the future, carrying the weight of her name with her, not shamefully, but openly, as it always should have been. By the second week of October, the village of Nether Whaddon had wrapped itself in the gentle predictability of autumn. The hedgerows were touched with gold, the church pews had taken on a pleasant chill, and the grocer had begun setting out boxes of windfall apples beside baskets of cinnamon sticks in anticipation of the harvest Thanksgiving. If one were to pass through the village now, nothing would seem amiss. The shadows that had gathered in recent weeks had been swept quietly into the corners, and yet, for those who had watched events unfold from the beginning, a subtle transformation lingered like a scent of smoke long after the fire had been doused. Miss Marple was not one to dwell. Her curiosity, once stirred, was always methodical but never sentimental. She had seen enough of human folly to recognize when a story had reached its final page, and so, with a shawl drawn over her shoulders and her knitting basket at her feet, she resumed the gentle rituals of her life. The garden needed pruning, the hearth a fresh scuttle of coal, and the Women's Institute was already drafting volunteers for the upcoming seasonal fair, but there were still visits to be made. On Tuesday morning, she walked with deliberate steps to the cottage of Mrs. Pendlebury, the bookstall operator whose table had, however unintentionally, become the stage for a crime, had taken the entire ordeal more personally than anyone else. Though she had not been harmed, Sylvia Pendlebury had since kept to herself, emerging only to collect the post and refill her tea caddy from Mrs. Withers's corner shop. She answered the door in a faded floral housecoat, her expression wary, until she saw who it was. "Miss Marple," she said with a tired smile. "I was beginning to think the village had forgotten me." "Don't be absurd," Miss Marple replied gently. "They're simply giving you space, but I find that space, like silence, can become rather overgrown. If not pruned occasionally." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Sylvia led her into the sitting room, where the scent of lavender furniture polish hung stubbornly in the air. A tea tray had been prepared, though it seemed untouched. Miss Marple poured for them both. "I thought you might like to know Mrs. Emery has returned to Kent. She left quietly, no fuss." Sylvia nodded. "I saw her, once, just before she left, walking by the green. I almost called out, but I didn't. She wouldn't have minded, I think," said Miss Marple. "She's made peace, of a sort. I wonder if I ever will," Sylvia murmured. "I still hear it, sometimes, the crash, the silence after. I keep asking myself if I'd just come back from the tea tent a minute earlier. You might have been the one to fall," Miss Marple finished gently, "and then we'd be speaking of your tragedy instead. But there's no use borrowing misfortunes from the past. Sylvia, you did nothing wrong." Sylvia nodded again, blinking fast. "Thank you, it helps to hear it said out loud." Before Miss Marple left, she paused at the door. "Next year's bookstall," she said casually, "might benefit from sturdier legs, and perhaps a young helper with a steadier hand." Sylvia gave a faint, startled laugh. "You mean Timothy? He feels guilty. You know, people often do, even when they shouldn't. Give him a task, and he'll recover some pride." With that, Miss Marple departed. Her next call was at the vicarage. Reverend Chiswick greeted her in his study, where sermon notes were scattered like autumn leaves. "You've come to see if I'm still brooding," he said with a sheepish smile. "Of course not," she said. "I've come to return your copy of Browning." He accepted the slim volume, eyes twinkling. "I'd forgotten I lent it, though I must say, it feels as though Browning's been whispering in every corner of the village lately." Miss Marple set down her gloves. "It's not poetry, Reverend, it's the confessions. This village has heard more of them in the last fortnight than it has in years." He nodded soberly. Do you think any of it will last? Oh, I expect most people will prefer to forget. It's easier, you see, politer. But I hope a few will remember what happened and why. The vicar leaned back, and Mrs. Whiting, she'll face whatever the courts decide. But I believe her real punishment began long ago, living beside the consequences of her silence. That night, Miss Marple returned home to find a parcel waiting on her doorstep. Wrapped in brown paper, it bore no label. Inside was a book, another copy of the last confession of Elsie Harwood, bound in soft blue cloth, its pages uncut and pristine. Attached was a note written in firm, unfamiliar hand, one for your library. Thank you for giving the story back to its rightful owner. Some things deserve to be read, even if only by the right person. She placed the book on her shelf between Cranford and the mayor of Casterbridge. Then she sat in her favourite chair and poured herself a quiet glass of sherry. Outside, the wind had begun to rise. The season was turning, and Netherwotton, like so many English villages before it, would carry on teacups filled, hedgerows clipped, secrets tucked neatly into drawers that would one day be reopened. Miss Marple looked down at her notebook and wrote a final line. Murder may cause a stir, but truth causes a shift. She underlined it once, then she put away the pen. The fire crackled softly behind her, and somewhere not far off, another mystery was beginning to stir, but that, she thought with a smile, could wait for another day.